I do love me those space stories. Remember that this podcast is already more than a year old, and this is actually, truth be told, episode number 424. So there have already been some real doozy stories involving space. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, a podcast now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. Today is special, though, because it is another start of something great. This time, we look back at the start of NASA. This day in weather history. It was on July 29th, 1958, when the U.S. Congress passed legislation establishing the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. We know it as NASA, a civilian agency responsible for coordinating America's activities in space. Remember, World War II ended a decade and a half earlier to this date, and the brightest minds of aeronautics and experimental jet propulsion science that had been forced to work for the Führer were now in the hands of the United States and put to work for their ambitious plans to win a space race against the Soviet Union. Now, we all know and have watched the hundreds of sponsored space expeditions that they have worked on, both human and mechanical, and we have marveled at what they have yielded as far as vital information about our solar system and the much vaster expanses of the overall universe. We have also benefited tremendously as a species from the numerous Earth-orbiting satellites that they have launched and which have been instrumental in everything from weather forecasting to navigation, global communications, television broadcast, our own in-car and watch GPS systems, pacemakers, so much. You name it, satellites have something to do with it. But we must again remember why they started in the first place. It was to thwart the Soviets' already established presence in space that the U.S. knew the world needed none of if it were to have a chance of sustained peace and freedom. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. But oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event, from when it happened, in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. I have covered the launch of Sputnik 1 on this podcast. So today we hit up how NASA was created in response to the Soviet Union's October 4th, 1957 launch of that first satellite. You have to understand, the Sputnik launch caught the Americans, I'll be honest with you, the world by surprise. And because this was the era of the Cold War, the U.S. understandably feared that the Soviets might also be arming them with capabilities of launching missiles with nuclear weapons from Europe to strike America. The United States also prided itself on being at the forefront of technology at that time, and therefore were understandably quite embarrassed by this, and the president was incensed. Things needed to be done. They needed to be done fast to right this wrong. They immediately began developing a response, and inadvertently triggered the start of the U.S.-Soviet space race, easily the most exciting and innovative time to that point in the history of planet Earth. The U.S. rushed their first trial to launch when in December they attempted to send a satellite of their own into space. It was the Vanguard. But it was not ready for prime time, and it exploded shortly after takeoff. Back to the drawing board. A new year brought new possibilities. On January 31st of now 1958, the U.S. got the Explorer 1, the first U.S. satellite to launch and then successfully orbit the Earth. Success at last. Now to create sustainability. Well, that came on July 29th, this day in weather history when Congress passed legislation officially establishing NASA from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics and other government agencies and confirming the country's commitment to winning the space race. This would very quickly change the game for weather observation and analysis for the good and forever. Without NASA, we have no weather satellites, and we have no satellite-carried broadcasts of 24-hour-a-day weather networks. You know, like the Weather Network here in Canada, where I hail from. Hello? Oh, and after this grand ribbon cutting, it would be on May 25th of 1961 when President John F. Kennedy would up the stakes again by declaring that America should put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. What happened next is for a future episode of This Day in Weather History. Tomorrow is July 30th, and we are looking back at what was said to have been a 1 in 1,000 year storm and flooding event for the state of Maryland. It happened back in 2016 and featured an absolute epic turn of events that defies meteorological logic. But that's the kind of story that gets us excited to listen every day to this podcast, This Day in Weather History, with me, your host, Chris May.